And for more on this, we're joined now by political analyst Dr. Dale McKinley. He joins us via Zoom to talk a little bit more about this. So firstly, the elephant in the room is whether or not the president will be disrupted. He will be able to deliver the presidency's budget speech, given the fact that there have been threats to do this over allegations of corruption at the theft at his Limpopo farm.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I think, first of all, the president will be there. I assume that he will be. I think he's going to essentially try to ignore whatever protests, whether it's the EFF or anybody else, is going to mount, which we should expect. I think, this is not new. We saw the same with ex-President Zuma, and we've seen this as it used as a tactic. Unfortunately, I mean, the charges obviously have thrown a whole range of politics into the mix because if one looks at it just purely in terms of allegations that have been leveled, well, that's exactly what they are. So but as we are wont to do, there's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of accusations, there's a lot of other kinds of politics being played out. And in some ways, that's somewhat healthy. But I think in terms of the presidency's budget vote, if we want to also pay attention to what we need to pay attention to in this country, not just the presidency in his case, but actually the economy and people's lives and people's jobs and what we're doing, then we should also be able to focus on those things because that's very real as well.
So let's talk about that. The State of the Nation address gives broad thematic, information around what the president intends to do. Some of the detail comes from the budget speech, but I want to talk about the role of the presidency first in the reconstruction of the economy, the recovery, social transformation. What role does this particular office play?
Well, it plays a fundamentally central role. Our Constitution and our legislative, executive, and judicial sort of authorities, the presidency holds a lot. It's the engine room in some ways of the executive, clearly, and also, I mean, the ministers, all the different departments. It's where the political decisions are made. It's where the framing of all the developmental policies and other policies, energy, all the key things, foreign policy. So it's fundamental. I mean, some would argue, and I think that there's a case to be made that we have actually too many powers associated with the presidency. And Cyril Ramaphosa has introduced even more so, even in his term. So there is a lot. We can cover almost every single aspect of our economy, of our social development, of our foreign policy that would come under the presidency fund, eventually, in terms of the trajectory of our entire country. So it's absolutely fundamental, not only to the democratic architecture, but it's fundamental also to the politics of our country and how it plays itself out.
Let's talk about the democratic architecture. I mean, there's a lot of debate around the extent of corruption in the South African state and how far back it goes. It is important to note that, though, because it takes away much needed resources from what the country is contending with. The exogenous shock of COVID-19 on the fiscus, the fact that revenue collection was low at a time when sovereign debt was high, unemployment also high. I mean, it is a balancing act that, has to be spoken about, that has to be addressed. So what do we expect from the president in dealing with this? Because there are a lot of eyes on him about the state capture report and action, legal and criminal action that is going to come out of that, because it does go back to the fact that, it's money being stolen out of the coffers. And as we mentioned, he is unfortunately facing the same kind of allegations against this mammoth task of priorities that I just mentioned.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, it does throw a huge spanner in the works, these allegations and the politics that surround that. But if we want to focus on some of the key things that our country really needs to focus on, then I expect that the president will begin to talk. First of all, he'll probably talk about some of the good news. And what would that be? It would be that the last quarter, there was quite a bit of GDP growth. The manufacturing sector, which has generally been fairly moribund, has grown. So he's going to point these things out. He's going to point that our inflation rate is less than the UK's, is less than the United States, that in some ways the macroeconomic situation is not as bad as it is elsewhere because of the global serious crisis, not only politically in Ukraine, but the energy crisis and food as well. So I think he'll probably talk about those things. But on the sort of more, how should we say, challenging or negative side, he's probably going to have to admit that in terms of trying to create the jobs that are needed, the productive opportunities, that they've fallen far short of that, the basic services as a result of a state that is unable to deliver almost the basics to a lot of particularly poor and working class people, that this is going to have huge sort of attention. He's going to probably talk about what they're going to do and the projects and other kinds of things, and job creation, the social grant, the special grants, all these other kinds of things that they'll emphasize of their attempts to try to deal with the situation. They'll probably announce some new initiatives with private sector, whether that's in energy or other kinds of infrastructural projects and other kinds of things. So I think he'll probably try to present a picture of somewhat realistically and saying we're not trying to ignore the realities, but also that there are some decent things happening. I think that's his job, and that's probably what he's going to do tomorrow.
So let's continue talking about those realities. One of the things that he said is that we are not only, and I quote him, we are not only determined to return our economy to where it was before the coronavirus, but to forge a new economy in a new global reality. And he said a lot of that lies with investment. We know that the investment, the environment for investors can be made typically fickle by some of these things. The perception of maladministration, the perception of poor management. So he mentioned areas of energy, telecommunications, ports, rail, infrastructure, and unfortunately these fall within this realm.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if one, for example, we know the case of Transnet, and we know the case of how exports have been fundamentally affected because of the theft of rail infrastructure. And this is a classic example. I mean, and the car manufacturing industry has been hit. I mean, obviously, there's also been natural disaster, the climate issues, the floods that happened in Durban didn't help things at all. In fact, they set them back even further. But I think, what the president is going to have to grapple with is whether or not in this crisis situation, not just in South Africa, but globally, whether or not you would continue to adopt an austerity budget and an austerity and try to pull things very close, or whether you try a more expansive task. Because the South Africans themselves are wanting more action, more impetus, more investment, and it's not just foreign investment. We're a wealthy country. Let's be clear. We're a wealthy country. The question is, how is that wealth distributed and how is it spent? And there's so much wastage and so much fruitless expenditure, not only in the state, by the way, but the private sector has to come on board too. We have one of the most corrupt private sectors in the world. And so they've got to stop just preaching from on high and come down and realize that it's something that if we want to talk about getting the country back on track on a range of different things, it's not just the politics in the state, it's also the politics in the private sector.
I mean, the presidency has said that enhancing conditions for growth would be growth enhancing reforms that are inclusive, competitive to growing the economy. And part of the macroeconomic framework that they mentioned was ensuring fiscal sustainability and a careful mobilization of these resources. So what then are we hoping to see going further? Because a lot of this has been on the table for quite a while. The conditions keep changing though, and the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Well, absolutely. If there's not some fundamental injection of capital into the economy and being used in a productive way, both from the private sector as well as from the state, then we're going to have the same. We're going to be talking about exactly the same scenario next year, a year from now, when the next budget is presented and the presidency is talking about these things. So what we have to have, and what I think that where President Ramaphosa has an opportunity on this front anyway to grasp the nettle, is to look at globally and look at where things are better than other places and what is being done. And what's clear is that you cannot, in a crisis situation, you cannot simply always be austere. You cannot simply just contract the money supply and the inflation and everything, because that has very real life consequences for ordinary people, and ordinary people are suffering. So if we're really serious about the democracy, both economic and political, then the president's going to pay attention to the majority and what the majority needs. And what the majority needs right now is an expansive budget, an investment from the state as well as the private sector, and leadership that is capable of trying to deliver. Not everything is going to always work out. There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be problems, but at least we must feel that there's a seriousness about addressing the problem, and not an elite class that's up there just basically ignoring the majority of the people.
Dr. Dale McKinley, thank you very much for your time, political analyst Dr. Dale McKinley. Some of the focal areas that the presidency has mentioned in the past or made promises around is, for instance, unlocking more than 1 trillion rand in infrastructure investment, creating 800,000 work opportunities, and also the promise to reduce data, particularly for expanding broadband access to low-income households, and of course reversing the decline in the local manufacturing sector and promoting reindustrialization through exports. So we're waiting to see or hear more from the presidency as it presents its budget tomorrow on some of these promises.